Please, don't go with him, Grandma. Those 6 words from my 10-year-old granddaughter's trembling lips stopped me cold in the doorway of my Phoenix apartment. I was holding my overnight bag, dressed in my best Sunday clothes, ready to embark on what I thought would be a romantic weekend getaway with Marcus, the charming man I'd been dating for 3 months. But something in little Emma's voice, the way her brown eyes filled with tears she was trying so hard to hold back, made me pause. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" I asked, setting down my bag and kneeling to her level. Emma had been staying with me for the past month while her parents worked through some marital difficulties, and in that time we'd grown incredibly close. She shook her head, unable to articulate what was bothering her, but her tiny hands gripped my sleeves with desperate intensity. I have a bad feeling, Grandma Helen. Please don't go. Now I need to tell you something about myself before this story goes any further. My name is Helen Martinez. I'm 72 years old, and I've been a widow for 8 years. After my husband Roberto died of a heart attack, I thought my days of romance were behind me forever. We'd been married for 43 wonderful years, raised 2 children, and built a life filled with love, laughter, and shared dreams. When he passed, I felt like half of my soul had been ripped away. For years, I focused entirely on my family, my part-time job at the local library, and my volunteer work at the senior center. Dating was the furthest thing from my mind. I'd convinced myself that at my age, finding love again was not only unlikely, but somehow disrespectful to Roberto's memory. That all changed last December when I met Marcus Thompson at the grocery store. I was struggling to reach a can of tomatoes on the top shelf when this tall, distinguished gentleman with silver hair and kind blue eyes appeared beside me. "Allow me," he said with a warm smile, easily retrieving the can and handing it to me with a slight bow that made me laugh despite myself. He was 68, recently retired from a successful career in real estate, and had moved to Phoenix from Chicago after his own wife's passing 2 years earlier. We struck up a conversation right there in the canned goods aisle, and before I knew it, we were having coffee together at the little cafe next to the library where I worked. Marcus was everything I thought I wanted in a companion for my golden years. He was well-educated, well-traveled, and had a way of making me feel young and vibrant again. He would bring me flowers, take me to nice restaurants, and listen with genuine interest when I talked about my grandchildren or my volunteer work. He seemed to understand the loneliness that comes with losing a life partner, and for the first time since Roberto's death, I began to imagine a future that included companionship, perhaps even love. My children were thrilled to see me happy again. My daughter Maria kept saying how wonderful it was to hear me laugh the way I used to, and my son Carlos approved of Marcus immediately, appreciating his respectful manner and obvious affection for me. But children, especially young children, sometimes see things that adults miss. Emma had met Marcus several times during our courtship, and while she was always polite, I'd noticed a certain wariness in her behavior around him. She would stay close to me when he visited, rarely speaking unless directly addressed, and I'd caught her watching him with an intensity that seemed unusual for a child her age. When I mentioned this to Marcus, he simply chuckled and said that some children take time to warm up to new people, especially when they're protective of their grandparents. His explanation seemed reasonable, and I didn't push the matter further. The weekend trip to Sedona had been Marcus's idea. He'd described a charming bed and breakfast nestled in the Red Rocks with hiking trails and art galleries, the perfect romantic getaway for 2 people our age who were ready to take their relationship to the next level. I'd been excited about the prospect, had even bought a new dress for dinner at the fancy restaurant he'd made reservations for. Everything seemed perfect, planned down to the smallest detail, which should have been my first warning sign. But love, even late-in-life love, has a way of making us overlook things that our more cautious selves might question. Standing there in my apartment doorway, looking down at Emma's frightened face, I felt the first stirring of doubt. This child had never asked me not to do anything before. She was mature for her age, understanding about adult relationships, and the fact that Grandma Helen deserved to be happy. So why was she so upset about this particular trip? Why did she look like she was fighting back tears at the thought of me leaving with Marcus? I glanced at my watch. Marcus would be here any minute to pick me up, and I still had no idea why Emma was so distressed. Can you tell me what's bothering you about Mr. Marcus? I asked gently, sitting down on my couch and pulling her into my lap. Emma buried her face against my shoulder, and I could feel her small body trembling. I heard him on the phone last night. She whispered so quietly, I almost didn't catch the words. When you were in the kitchen making tea, he was talking to someone about you and money, and something about papers. My blood ran cold. What papers? What money? Marcus and I had never discussed finances beyond splitting the check at restaurants, and I'd certainly never mentioned my modest savings or the life insurance money Roberto had left me. The sound of Marcus's car pulling into my driveway sent a jolt of anxiety through my chest, but Emma's revelation had planted a seed of suspicion that I couldn't ignore. What exactly did you hear him say, sweetheart? I whispered urgently, my arms tightening protectively around her small frame. Emma lifted her head, her dark eyes wide with the kind of fear that children shouldn't have to experience. He said something about getting you alone, away from family, and then he mentioned lawyers and signatures. He kept saying, the old lady won't know what hit her, and laughing in a mean way, Grandma. Not like when he laughs with you. The doorbell rang, its cheerful chime now sounding ominous in light of what Emma had just revealed. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure she could feel it through my chest, but I forced myself to remain calm for her sake. Listen to me very carefully, I said, looking directly into her eyes. I want you to go to your room and call your mother. Tell her exactly what you just told me, and ask her to come pick you up right now. Don't mention any of this to Mr. Marcus, okay? Emma nodded solemnly, her maturity in that moment both heartbreaking and reassuring. She slipped off my lap and disappeared down the hallway just as the doorbell rang again, followed by Marcus's familiar voice calling out, Helen, darling, are you ready for our adventure? I took a deep breath, smoothed my dress, and opened the door with what I hoped was a convincing smile. Marcus stood there looking impeccable as always, dressed in a crisp polo shirt and khakis, his silver hair perfectly styled, holding a bouquet of my favorite roses. But for the first time since I'd known him, something about his smile didn't reach his eyes. Had it always been that way, and I'd been too infatuated to notice? You look absolutely stunning, he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. His cologne, which had always smelled sophisticated and appealing, now seemed overwhelming and cloying. Thank you for the flowers, I said, accepting the bouquet but not inviting him inside as I usually would. Actually, Marcus, I'm afraid I'm not feeling very well. I think I might be coming down with something, and I don't want to ruin our weekend or risk getting you sick. It was a weak excuse, but it was all I could come up with on such short notice. The change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable. The charming mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath, before snapping back into place. Oh, that's disappointing, he said, his voice maintaining its warm tone, even as his eyes narrowed slightly. Are you sure you can't tough it out? I've already paid for the room, and they have a strict no-refund policy. Besides, the fresh mountain air might be just what you need to feel better. The pressure in his voice was gentle but persistent, and I realized that in all our previous interactions, Marcus had always been remarkably persuasive when he wanted something. Had I simply been too lonely and flattered by his attention to recognize manipulation when I saw it? I'm really not feeling up to it, I insisted, clutching the roses a little tighter. Perhaps we could reschedule for next weekend. The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever. Marcus stood there studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable, as if he were trying to read my thoughts. Finally, he smiled again, but this time it looked forced and unnatural. Of course, darling. Your health comes first, though I have to say, this is quite unexpected. You seemed perfectly fine yesterday when we confirmed our plans. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Marcus kept glancing past me into the apartment, as if he were looking for something, or someone. Is Emma here? He asked casually, too casually. I thought I heard her voice when I was walking up to the door. The question sent alarm bells ringing in my head. Why was he asking about Emma? Why did it matter if she was here or not? She's taking a nap, I lied smoothly. Children her age need their rest, you know. Of course, he said, but he didn't look convinced. Well, I suppose I should let you get your rest too. Feel better, Helen. I'll call you tomorrow to check on you. He leaned in for another kiss, but I turned my head slightly so his lips landed on my cheek rather than my mouth. As he walked back to his car, I noticed him making a phone call before he even reached the driver's door. Who was he calling? And why couldn't whatever he had to say wait until he was out of my driveway? I closed and locked the door, my hands shaking as I turned the deadbolt. Through the window, I watched Marcus sit in his car for what seemed like an eternity, talking animatedly on his phone and occasionally glancing back at my apartment. When he finally drove away, I felt a mixture of relief and growing dread. Emma emerged from her room, her face pale but determined. "I called Mom," she said. "She's coming right now, and she said to tell you she's calling Uncle Carlos too." Within 20 minutes, my apartment was filled with family. Maria arrived first, her protective instincts in full force as she swept Emma into a fierce hug and demanded to know exactly what had happened. Carlos showed up shortly after with his wife Sophia, and together we all sat around my kitchen table while Emma recounted what she'd overheard. The conversation she described painted a picture of a man I didn't recognize, someone who spoke about me with cold calculation rather than affection, who seemed to view our relationship as some kind of business transaction rather than a romantic connection. Carlos immediately wanted to call the police, his protective brother instincts flaring up in a way that reminded me so much of his father. "This guy is obviously a predator, Mom. He's been grooming you for months, gaining your trust so he could get you alone and isolated. God knows what his real plan was." But I hesitated, my mind racing through months of interactions with Marcus, trying to separate genuine red flags from the paranoia that Emma's revelation had sparked. Was I overreacting to a child's misunderstanding of an adult conversation? Or had I been blind to warning signs that should have been obvious to a woman my age? Sophia, ever the voice of reason, suggested we do some research before taking any drastic action. "Let's find out who this Marcus Thompson really is," she said, pulling out her phone. "If he's legitimate, we'll know soon enough. If he's not..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. The implications hung heavy in the air as we all gathered around her phone, watching as she typed Marcus's name into various search engines and social media platforms. What we found, or rather what we didn't find, was more disturbing than any criminal record could have been. Marcus Thompson, 68-year-old retired real estate agent from Chicago, simply didn't exist online. No LinkedIn profile from his supposed successful career, no property records from the Chicago area, no obituary for the wife he claimed to have lost 2 years ago. There were Marcus Thompsons in Chicago, of course, but none matching the age and description of the man I'd been dating. It was as if he'd materialized out of thin air 3 months ago, with nothing but charm and carefully crafted stories about a life that may never have existed. "Mom," Maria said gently, taking my hand across the table, "when did he first ask you about your financial situation?" I thought back to our early conversations, trying to remember when topics had shifted from general getting-to-know-you questions to more personal territory. It had been subtle, I realized now, woven into discussions about retirement plans and travel dreams. He'd expressed admiration for my independence, my ability to maintain my own home and lifestyle after Roberto's death. I'd felt proud sharing how Roberto had been so responsible about life insurance, how I'd been careful with investments, how I owned my home outright, and had enough savings to live comfortably for the rest of my life. The memories that had once felt like intimate moments of sharing now took on a sinister quality under the harsh light of suspicion. Marcus had been remarkably interested in the details of my financial security, asking follow-up questions that had seemed like genuine care for my well-being. Now I wondered if he'd been taking mental notes, calculating the potential value of gaining access to my assets. Had every romantic gesture been a calculated move in a long-term con game? Emma, who had been quietly coloring at the far end of the table while the adults talked, suddenly looked up with the kind of insight that children sometimes possess. "Grandma, remember when Mr. Marcus asked me about the pictures on your refrigerator? He wanted to know if you had any other family besides us, if anyone else visited you regularly." I did remember that conversation, and at the time I'd thought it was sweet that he was taking an interest in my family connections. Now I realized he might have been assessing potential obstacles to whatever scheme he was planning. Carlos was already on his laptop, his IT background proving invaluable as he dug deeper into the mystery of Marcus Thompson. "Mom, did he ever show you any identification? Driver's license, credit cards, anything with his name on it?" I shook my head, realizing that in 3 months of dating, I'd never seen any form of ID. He always paid for our meals with cash, claiming he preferred it for budgeting purposes. Even his car, which I'd admired for its pristine condition, bore license plates that Carlos was now tracing through databases he had access to through his work. "The car is registered to a Robert Martinez in Tucson," Carlos announced, his voice grim. "And get this, Robert Martinez filed a police report 2 months ago claiming his identity had been stolen, including his car registration and insurance information." The web of deception was unraveling before our eyes, revealing a level of sophisticated fraud that made my blood run cold. This wasn't some lonely widower looking for companionship. This was a professional criminal who had targeted me specifically for reasons that were becoming increasingly clear. Sophia found the final piece of the puzzle on a website dedicated to exposing romance scams. There, among dozens of photos of men who used fake identities to prey on vulnerable women, was Marcus Thompson's face under the name David Walsh. The accompanying article detailed his method of operation. He targeted recently widowed women with substantial assets, spent months building trust and emotional dependency, then used various pretexts to gain access to their financial information, or to isolate them from their support systems. The Sedona trip, I realized with growing horror, hadn't been a romantic getaway. It had been step 1 in whatever endgame he had planned. The article mentioned several victims, women who had lost their life savings, their homes, even their identities to this man's elaborate schemes. Some had been found dead under suspicious circumstances after emptying their bank accounts and transferring property deeds. The thought that I had come so close to being his next victim made me physically ill. I ran to the bathroom and lost what little I'd managed to eat that day, my body's response to the realization that I'd been living in a carefully constructed fantasy for months. When I returned to the kitchen, my family was in full protective mode. Carlos was on the phone with the police, Maria was documenting everything we'd discovered, and Sophia was calling a locksmith to have all my locks changed immediately. Emma came over and slipped her small hand into mine, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry I scared you earlier, Grandma. I just knew something was wrong." The next few hours passed in a blur of police reports, safety precautions, and the gradual understanding of just how thoroughly I'd been deceived. Detective Patricia Williams, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in elder fraud cases, arrived at my apartment with a thick file that she spread across my dining room table. "Mrs. Martinez," she said, her voice gentle but serious, "you're incredibly fortunate that you didn't go on that trip. Based on what we know about this individual's previous crimes, isolated locations like remote bed and breakfasts are where he typically escalates his activities." The photographs she showed me were devastating. Marcus Thompson, or David Walsh, or whatever his real name was, had been using the same identity for at least 2 years across 3 states. Each victim's story followed a similar pattern. A vulnerable widow, carefully selected for her financial stability and social isolation, courted with elaborate attention and romantic gestures, then systematically stripped of her assets through various sophisticated schemes. What made my case different, Detective Williams explained, was that none of his previous victims had children living nearby, and certainly none had a perceptive granddaughter who could overhear incriminating phone conversations. "The Sedona trip was likely where he planned to have you sign over power of attorney," the detective continued, pointing to documents from previous cases. "He typically presents it as a romantic gesture, helping with your legal affairs so you can focus on enjoying your time together. Once he has access to your accounts, the money disappears quickly through a network of shell companies and offshore transfers that are nearly impossible to trace." The thought of how close I'd come to financial ruin was terrifying enough, but Detective Williams' next revelation was even more chilling. In at least 3 cases that we know of, when victims began to resist or ask questions, they suffered what appeared to be accidental deaths. Falls downstairs, medication overdoses, carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty heaters, all situations that could easily be staged to look like unfortunate accidents befalling elderly individuals. The detective's words hung in the air like a death sentence I'd narrowly escaped. If I'd gone to Sedona, if I'd been isolated and dependent on Marcus for transportation back home, would I have ever made it back alive? Emma, who had been listening from the hallway despite our attempts to keep her occupied elsewhere, crept back into the room, and climbed onto my lap. "Will the bad man come back, Grandma?" she asked with the directness that only children possess. Detective Williams knelt down to Emma's eye level, her expression softening. "That's why we're here, sweetheart. We're going to make sure your grandmother is safe, and we're going to catch this man so he can't hurt anyone else." The plan that emerged from our strategy session was both simple and complex. I would continue to act as if I believed Marcus's identity while working with law enforcement to gather evidence for his arrest. Detective Williams explained that romance scam cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute without concrete proof of criminal intent, but my situation provided an unprecedented opportunity to catch him in the act. "We need him to make his move," she said, "to actually attempt to defraud you in a way we can document and use in court." The next morning, I called Marcus from a phone that Detective Williams had equipped with recording equipment. My hands were shaking as I dialed, but I forced my voice to sound weak and apologetic. "Marcus, darling, I'm feeling much better today. I was wondering if we might be able to reschedule our trip for next weekend?" His response was immediate and enthusiastic, almost too eager given how disappointed he'd seemed the day before. "Helen, that's wonderful news. I was so worried about you. Of course we can reschedule. In fact, I have an even better idea." The better idea involved a change of location to a more remote cabin that belonged to a friend of his, somewhere in the mountains outside of Flagstaff, where we could have complete privacy and wouldn't be disturbed by other guests. The red flags were so obvious now that I wondered how I'd ever miss them, but I played my part perfectly, expressing delight at the prospect of such an intimate getaway. When he mentioned bringing some important documents that he wanted to discuss with me about our future together, Detective Williams nodded approvingly from across the room. That afternoon, while Carlos and Sophia took Emma to the park to distract her from the stress of the situation, Maria and I sat together on my couch, processing the emotional aftermath of discovering that my late-in-life romance had been nothing more than an elaborate criminal enterprise. "I feel so stupid," I confessed to my daughter, tears streaming down my face for the first time since this nightmare had begun. "How could I have been so blind, so desperate for companionship that I ignored every warning sign?" Maria took my hands in hers, her eyes fierce with protective love. "Mom, you weren't stupid. You were a woman who had loved the same man for 43 years and thought you'd never experience romance again. When someone offered you that gift, you accepted it with the same generous heart that's defined your entire life. That's not stupidity. That's courage." Her words helped ease some of the shame I'd been carrying, but the fear remained constant and overwhelming. The psychological manipulation had been so gradual, so expertly executed, that I was only now beginning to understand its full scope. Marcus had identified my vulnerabilities with surgical precision: my loneliness after Roberto's death, my desire to feel attractive and valued, my guilt about being a financial burden on my children, my fear of spending my remaining years alone. Every conversation, every gesture, every romantic moment had been calculated to exploit these insecurities while building my emotional dependence on him. The week leading up to our rescheduled trip was a masterclass in psychological warfare that I was only beginning to understand as I lived through it. Marcus called every day, sometimes multiple times, always with some new detail about our romantic weekend that was designed to build my excitement and lower my guard. He spoke about candlelit dinners, long walks in nature, and intimate conversations about our future together. Conversations that I now knew were meant to culminate in my signing away my financial security and possibly my life. Detective Williams had arranged for surveillance teams to monitor my apartment and track Marcus's movements, but the waiting was excruciating. Every time my phone rang, every unexpected sound outside my door sent my heart racing with the possibility that Marcus had somehow discovered our plan. The stress was taking a visible toll on my family as well. Carlos had taken time off work to stay nearby. Maria checked on me hourly, and even Emma seemed to sense the underlying tension despite our efforts to maintain normalcy around her. On Wednesday afternoon, Marcus surprised me with an unscheduled visit, appearing at my door with flowers and a concerned expression that I now recognized as carefully manufactured. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd check on you," he said, his eyes scanning my apartment with an intensity that made my skin crawl. You sounded a bit tired during our phone call yesterday, and I want to make sure you're feeling up to our trip. The hidden recording device that Detective Williams had installed captured every word, every subtle threat disguised as caring concern. What disturbed me most about that visit was how naturally the deception came to him. He sat in my living room, drinking the tea I'd prepared, asking about my day with what appeared to be genuine interest, all while planning my destruction. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. This was the same man who had made me laugh over dinner, who had held my hand during romantic movies, who had listened sympathetically when I talked about missing Roberto. How could someone fake such convincing displays of human emotion while harboring such malicious intent? I've been thinking about our conversation regarding your late husband's life insurance policy, Marcus said casually, as if discussing the weather. It's wonderful that Roberto was so responsible, making sure you'd be financially secure. But have you considered how vulnerable that makes you? A woman living alone with substantial assets? It's not always safe. The threat was subtle but unmistakable, wrapped in the language of protective concern that had characterized our entire relationship. That evening, after Marcus left, I found myself looking through photo albums from my marriage to Roberto, trying to reconnect with memories that felt pure and honest in contrast to the contaminated experiences of the past 3 months. Roberto had been many things: stubborn, occasionally grumpy, obsessed with baseball statistics, but he had never been anything other than genuine in his affections. The man I'd loved for 43 years had never calculated the cost-benefit ratio of caring for me, had never seen my emotions as tools to be manipulated for his advantage. Emma found me crying over those photographs and climbed into my lap without saying a word. We sat together in comfortable silence, her small presence grounding me in the reality of unconditional love that Marcus's manipulations had tried to erode. "Do you miss Grandpa Roberto?" she asked eventually, her voice soft with the kind of wisdom that children sometimes possess. "Every day," I told her honestly, "but I'm grateful for the time we had together, and I'm grateful that he taught me what real love looks like." Friday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. Detective Williams and her team had positioned themselves strategically along the route to the cabin where Marcus planned to take me, with backup units ready to move in at the first sign of trouble. I was wearing a GPS tracker disguised as a pendant, carrying a cell phone with an open line to law enforcement, and had a panic button sewn into the lining of my purse. Despite all these precautions, the fear was almost paralyzing. Marcus arrived precisely on time, dressed in hiking clothes and carrying a duffel bag that presumably contained the important documents he wanted me to sign. His demeanor was different somehow, more focused, less performatively charming. It was as if he'd dropped some of the pretense now, that he believed his endgame was within reach. "Ready for our adventure, beautiful?" he asked, but his smile didn't reach his eyes, and I noticed his hand resting possessively on my lower back as he guided me toward his car. The drive to the cabin took nearly 2 hours through increasingly remote mountain roads. Marcus kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out scenic views and sharing fabricated stories about previous visits to the area with his fictional deceased wife. But I could sense his growing tension as we moved further from civilization, away from potential witnesses or sources of help. The GPS tracker around my neck felt like both a lifeline and a target, and I found myself wondering if he somehow knew about the law enforcement presence that was hopefully following at a discreet distance. When we finally reached the cabin, my heart sank. It was even more isolated than I'd imagined. A small, rustic structure at the end of a winding dirt road, surrounded by dense forest with no neighboring properties visible in any direction. The nearest town was at least 30 miles away, and cell phone reception was virtually non-existent. If something went wrong here, if the police couldn't track our location, or if Marcus discovered the recording equipment, I would be completely at his mercy in a place where no one would hear me scream. The cabin interior was exactly what I'd expected from a location chosen for its isolation and lack of witnesses: sparse, dimly lit, with heavy curtains that blocked most of the natural light. Marcus immediately began closing those curtains, claiming it would give us more privacy for our romantic weekend, but I could see him checking the windows as he did so, ensuring that no one could observe what happened inside. The single room contained only the basic necessities: a bed, a small kitchen area, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and most ominously, no landline telephone. "Isn't this perfect?" Marcus said, his voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. "Just you and me, completely alone, with no distractions from the outside world." He unpacked his duffel bag with deliberate movements, laying out manila folders and legal documents on the table with the precision of someone who had performed this routine many times before. "I thought this would be the perfect time to discuss our future together, Helen. I've prepared some paperwork that will protect both of us as we move forward in our relationship." The documents he spread across the table were a masterpiece of legal manipulation, disguised as romantic planning. Power of attorney forms that would give him complete control over my finances, property transfer deeds that would add his name to my home ownership, and investment account authorizations that would allow him to move my savings without my direct approval. Each document was carefully worded to sound like mutual protection and shared financial planning, but I could now see them for what they really were, the instruments of my complete financial destruction. "These seem quite complex," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady while my heart pounded against my ribs. "Perhaps I should have my lawyer review them before I sign anything." The change in Marcus's demeanor was immediate and frightening. The mask of charming concern slipped completely, replaced by cold calculation and barely contained anger. "Helen," he said, his voice soft but menacing, "we're supposed to be building trust in our relationship. Don't you think having lawyers involved sends the wrong message about our commitment to each other?" I pretended to consider his words while desperately hoping that the GPS tracker was still functioning and that law enforcement was close enough to intervene if the situation escalated. "You're right, of course," I said, picking up one of the documents with trembling hands. "It's just that Roberto always handled our legal affairs, and I'm not used to making these kinds of decisions alone." Marcus moved closer, his presence suddenly feeling threatening rather than comforting. "That's exactly why you need someone to take care of these matters for you," he said. "A woman your age shouldn't have to worry about complex financial decisions." The condescension in his voice was a stark contrast to the respectful way he'd spoken to me throughout our courtship. Now that he believed he had me isolated and vulnerable, the real Marcus was emerging. A predator who saw elderly women not as human beings deserving of love and respect, but as resources to be exploited and discarded. I thought about the other victims Detective Williams had described. Women who had sat in similar isolated locations, faced with similar documents, unaware that they were signing away not just their financial security, but potentially their lives. "Before I sign anything," I said, standing up from the table with as much dignity as I could muster, "I'd like to call my daughter and let her know I arrived safely. She worries when I travel, you know." Marcus's response was swift and decisive. He reached into his jacket and pulled out my cell phone, which he must have taken from my purse while I was distracted by the documents. "I'm afraid there's no cell service up here," he said with false sympathy. "But don't worry, I already let your family know we arrived safely." The lie was so blatant, so obviously calculated to cut off my last connection to the outside world, that I felt my carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "When did you call them?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "And how did you get their numbers?" Marcus's smile was cold and predatory as he set my phone down on the kitchen counter, well out of my reach. "Helen, darling, you're being unnecessarily suspicious. Can't you just trust me to take care of everything?" That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the kitchen counter, next to where he'd placed my phone, were several small bottles of medication that hadn't been there when we arrived. The labels were turned away from me, but their presence suggested a level of premeditation that went far beyond financial fraud. I thought about Detective Williams's words about previous victims who had died from apparent medication overdoses, and I realized that Marcus's plan might involve ensuring I never left this cabin alive to report his crimes. "I think I need some fresh air," I said, moving toward the door with deliberate casualness. "The altitude is making me feel a bit dizzy." But Marcus was faster than I'd anticipated for a man his age. He positioned himself between me and the exit, his friendly demeanor completely abandoned. "I think you should sit down, Helen," he said, no longer bothering to disguise the threat in his voice. "We have important business to finish here, and I'd hate for you to do anything foolish." The word foolish hung in the air between us like a death sentence. I was trapped in an isolated cabin with a man who had killed before, surrounded by legal documents designed to steal my life savings and medication that could easily be used to stage my accidental death. My only hope was that Detective Williams and her team were close enough to intervene, but with no cell service and no way to activate my panic button, I was completely dependent on their ability to track my GPS signal through the dense forest. The standoff in that cramped cabin felt like an eternity, though it couldn't have lasted more than a few minutes. Marcus stood between me and the door. His entire body language transformed from the gentle, caring man I thought I'd known into something predatory and dangerous. "Now, Helen," he said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that abusers use when they believe they have complete control over their victims. "Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. You're going to sign these documents, and then we're going to have a lovely dinner together. I've prepared something special for you." My eyes darted to those medication bottles on the counter, and I understood with crystalline clarity that whatever Marcus had prepared for dinner would likely be my last meal. The special ingredient would ensure that I never woke up to regret signing away my life savings, never lived to tell law enforcement about his elaborate deception, never had the chance to warn other vulnerable women about the charming predator who moved through retirement communities like a wolf in sheep's clothing. "What if I refused to sign?" I asked, surprising myself with the steadiness of my own voice. Marcus's laugh was cold and humorless. "Helen, you're a 72-year-old woman alone in the wilderness with a man who's significantly younger and stronger than you. I don't think you're in a position to refuse anything." The threat was explicit now, all pretense of romance and caring stripped away to reveal the calculating monster underneath. That's when I heard it, the distant sound of car engines echoing through the forest, growing steadily closer. Marcus heard it too, his head snapping toward the window with alarm. "Stay right there," he hissed, rushing to peer through the curtains. But I could see the panic in his movements, the realization that his carefully planned scheme was falling apart. The sound of multiple vehicles approaching sent a surge of hope through my chest. Detective Williams had found us. The GPS tracker had worked. Help was coming. Marcus spun around, his face contorted with rage and desperation. "You called them, didn't you?" he snarled. "You set me up." Before I could respond, he lunged toward the kitchen counter where those mysterious medication bottles waited. I knew instinctively that whatever he planned to do with them, I couldn't let him reach them. With strength I didn't know I still possessed, I grabbed the heavy wooden chair from the table and swung it toward Marcus with all my might. It connected with his shoulder, sending him stumbling backward but not down. The impact jarred my arms painfully, but it bought me precious seconds to move toward the door. "Help!" I screamed at the top of my lungs, hoping my voice would carry through the forest to the approaching vehicles. "Help me!" Marcus recovered quickly, his face twisted with fury as he advanced on me again. But then, the cabin door exploded inward, and Detective Williams burst through with her weapon drawn, followed by 2 other officers in tactical gear. "Phoenix Police, get on the ground now!" The sight of armed law enforcement seemed to deflate Marcus instantly. The predatory confidence evaporated, replaced by the pathetic whimpering of a cornered criminal who knew his game was over. The arrest of Marcus Thompson, whose real name turned out to be William David Kessler, was swift and thorough. As the officers handcuffed him and read him his rights, I could hardly believe that this broken, whimpering man was the same person who had charmed me over candle-lit dinners and made me believe in romance again. Detective Williams found evidence in his duffel bag that connected him to at least 7 other victims across 4 states, including detailed profiles with photographs, financial information, and even psychological assessments that helped him tailor his approach to each woman's specific vulnerabilities. The medication bottles on the counter contained a lethal combination of sedatives and heart medication that, when mixed together, would have caused what appeared to be a natural cardiac event in a woman my age. The coroner would have attributed my death to the stress of travel and the excitement of a new relationship, never suspecting murder. My body would have been discovered the next morning by Marcus, who would have played the role of the grieving boyfriend while secretly celebrating his access to my now unprotected assets. The legal documents he'd prepared were equally sophisticated, designed to transfer ownership of my home and access to my bank accounts in a way that would have appeared completely legal to any casual observer. His plan was to keep me alive just long enough to sign everything, then eliminate the only witness who could connect him to the fraud. It was a scheme he'd perfected over years of preying on lonely widows, each crime making him bolder and more confident in his ability to manipulate the legal system. The drive back to Phoenix felt surreal, as if I were waking up from a nightmare that had lasted months rather than hours. Detective Williams rode with me, explaining how the investigation would proceed and what I could expect in terms of court proceedings and testimony. She also shared something that brought tears to my eyes. Emma's phone call had likely saved not just my life, but the lives of future victims who would have fallen prey to Marcus's deadly charm. When we arrived at my apartment, I found my entire family waiting for me. Carlos had tears streaming down his face as he crushed me in a bear hug that reminded me so much of his father. Maria couldn't stop apologizing for not recognizing the danger sooner, though there was nothing she could have done differently. And Emma, my brave little granddaughter, looked up at me with eyes full of relief and pride. "I knew something was wrong, Grandma," she said simply. "I just knew." The psychological aftermath of discovering that someone had spent months planning my murder was more difficult than I'd anticipated. For weeks, I questioned every interaction I'd ever had with Marcus, wondering how I could have been so thoroughly deceived. I struggled with feelings of shame and foolishness, despite everyone telling me that I'd been the victim of a sophisticated criminal who had perfected his techniques on dozens of other women. It took months of counseling and the unwavering support of my family to understand that my capacity for trust and love wasn't a weakness to be ashamed of, but a strength that Marcus had tried to exploit. Dr. Patricia Valdez, the therapist Detective Williams recommended, helped me see that choosing to remain open to companionship after loss takes tremendous courage, and that Marcus's betrayal said nothing about my judgment and everything about his criminal nature. The trial was difficult, but cathartic. Taking the stand to testify about Marcus's manipulation and the terror I'd felt in that isolated cabin was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. But seeing him sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole brought a sense of justice and closure. The judge specifically mentioned Emma's bravery in preventing what could have been another tragic ending to Marcus's string of victims. Today, 3 years later, I still live in the same apartment in Phoenix, surrounded by the love and protection of my family. I volunteer at the senior center, teaching other older adults about romance scams and helping them recognize the warning signs that I had missed. My story has been featured in law enforcement training materials and community education programs, reaching thousands of people who might otherwise become victims of similar schemes. Emma, now 13 and wiser than her years, still visits me every weekend. We've developed a special bond that goes beyond the typical grandmother-granddaughter relationship. We're survivors together, connected by a shared experience that tested our courage and strengthened our trust in each other. She often tells people that she saved her grandmother's life, and I always correct her. We saved each other. I think about Roberto often, especially when I'm tempted to feel bitter about what Marcus stole from me. My late husband taught me that love is built on truth, respect, and genuine care for another person's well-being. What Marcus offered was a counterfeit that I mistook for the real thing because I was grieving the loss of authentic love. But Roberto's legacy lives on in the way my family rallied to protect me, in Emma's intuitive understanding of right and wrong, and in my renewed appreciation for relationships built on honesty rather than manipulation. The romantic dreams I'd harbored about finding companionship in my golden years have evolved into something deeper and more meaningful. Gratitude for the love I already have, pride in my strength and resilience, and hope that sharing my story might protect other women from experiencing the terror and betrayal I survived. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can say isn't, "I love you" or "trust me," but "listen to your instincts" and "you are worth protecting." Emma was right that day when she begged me not to go with him. Sometimes children see dangers that adults miss, and sometimes the most important voice to listen to is the small, quiet one that whispers warnings when everyone else is telling us everything is fine. That's my story, and I hope it helps someone else recognize that their safety and well-being are worth more than any promise of romance or companionship. Trust your instincts, value your family's concerns, and never forget that you deserve love that builds you up rather than puts you at risk.